startling doctrine. Those who've studied early Christianity find that there are doctrines after doctrines that were believed, or that were had widespread believers in early Christianity that simply are looked upon as being heretical today. And it's I would think that somebody who was coming from the perspective that some particular brand of Christianity today that's in existence, any of the major kinds of Christianity or brands of Christianity today, is someone who's thinking that those trace back directly to the earliest Christianity are going to find themselves wrestling to some substantial extent if they go back to early Christianity to try and see what early Christianity, what the early church fathers taught and believed.
I think that's true. I think no matter what church you look at today, whether it be Protestant or Catholic, if somebody from one of those denominations were to go back and join for a day or two and sit in on the meetings on the Sabbath that were held by the early Christians, I think they might be very, very surprised at what was taught. And I might add that although I think Latter-day Saints might be a bit more comfortable with with many of these doctrines than Protestants and Catholics might, there would certainly be some ideas there that would be startling to Latter-day Saints as well. So I'm certainly not trying to come up with the idea that the early Christian churches in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries were somehow early versions of Latter-day Saint faith. That just isn't quite the case.
The doctrines which to me seem to be the most significant, there are all kinds of interesting little doctrines, doctrinal views that were held by a few and never had any widespread acceptance. That there are a lot of those interesting ideas, but as you go over what I think you would consider the main ideas of Christianity, every single one you find a very substantial difference in what was held in the early church and what is believed today. And I'm speaking, of course, we've already mentioned salvation, but you can go further into the subject of salvation to look at the question of how does a person attain salvation? Is it by grace, or is it by living a righteous life? And the overwhelming answer to that question in the first few centuries of Christianity was that salvation is entirely tied. It's tied inescapably to the kind of life a person lives. There's no way of living an unrighteous life and attaining to salvation. Righteousness is an absolute essential requirement of salvation. Tied also into that is the idea of water baptism. That was the common practice, widespread throughout Christianity, crossing all boundaries in the early centuries, was that water baptism is for the remission of sins, and that it's something which is essential for salvation.
That's right, and it's also something that was not done for infants. It was something that was sort of something that crept in a little bit later, and also for the sick. The idea of sprinkling crept in later when you had somebody who wanted to join the gospel, but they were physically unable to do it, or you had a young child who was about ready to die, or who perhaps it was thought was not going to make it, and so they started to alter it. That's what the scholars that I've read on the subject are saying.
Another thing too, looking at the idea of the church, and this is I think a very important idea. There are two concepts, two main concepts of the church today. One is that the Church of Jesus Christ is a heavenly organization, and you can obtain membership in this heavenly organization here on earth, but it has nothing to do with attending any kind of meetings or anything like that. It's a matter of just being accepted into the Church of the Firstborn, that kind of idea that has been taught and promulgated very, very widely through the, particularly in our country with the born again movement. And then there's the idea that that there is an actual earthly organization that Christ directs, and that a person must belong to that organization, be in harmony with that organization if he expects salvation. I think everyone's saying you have to belong to the Church of Jesus Christ to be saved. The question is, are you talking about a heavenly church, or are you talking about something here on earth? And today, it would seem to me like most are saying that it doesn't matter what church you belong to here on earth. The earthly organizations are optional, and they're nice. They do some good. They have some problems, but and it's nice to belong to one, but it doesn't really have anything to do with your salvation. However, in the early church, well, in fact, in the early church, there were these two ideas were also prevalent. Those who were arguing for kind of the born-again Christian idea that your salvation depends solely upon a personal relationship or a personal experience with Jesus, those were the Gnostics. And they died out after several centuries, but the Gnostics were arguing that against the idea of any kind of an earthly organization. But those whose writings have been primarily preserved, and who were the Orthodox, viewed as the Orthodox leaders of the first few centuries, are all saying the same thing, basically, and that is that there is simply no way of being out of harmony with the bishop and the elders, and they're talking about the earthly church, an earthly organization. You have to be a part of this if you expect to be found in favor with God, and if you expect salvation. And it's like there are a lot of callers. I've got a number of passages that I could read from the early 2nd century, the first half of the 2nd century, on this particular point, from a collection called the Apostolic Fathers. I'll maybe just hold off on some of those and go to them a little bit later on. But this is one of the major doctrines of the early church, is that there is an actual earthly organization that was established under the direction of Jesus Christ through his apostles, and one must participate in that body in order to be in favor with God and to have any anticipation of salvation.
That's his style.
Well, and last week you pressed him a couple of times on the question of whether or not he saw any similarity between LDS beliefs, any parallel between LDS beliefs and the statements of the early Christians on deification. I mean, you remember that?
I do, and he said there was absolutely no parallel.
Yeah.
I just, with somebody who can't see the material that maybe I can say it even more bluntly. If he can't understand the thousands of pages that he has read that have been written by the early church fathers, which do more than suggest a parallel, which show a very striking parallel, then I think he is either brainwashed, deluded, or lying, and I'm not here to judge which, but I would say it that strongly.
Well, or he's what I would think would be maybe more likely is that he's allowed his strong bias to put blinders on and not be able to see parallels where they exist.
Yes, hello, Martin and Dan.
Hi.
I would like to say that I have a follow-up comment on last week's program by saying that that I agreed with you and Van on the concessions that you're making, that early Christianity is quite diverse,